At 0600 hours on December 18, 1944, Staff Sergeant Frank Miller sat in a foxhole on the edge of the Ardennes forest. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was in the ground, in the trees, and in the bones of every man in the platoon. It was the kind of cold that turned motor oil into glue and made steel brittle enough to crack. Miller wasn't thinking about his frozen feet. He was thinking about the 11 pounds of walnut and steel resting across his lap. It was a Thompson M1A submachine gun. To the folks back home reading the newspapers, this weapon was a legend. It was the Tommy gun, the weapon that tamed Chicago, the chopper that gangster movies made famous. It was beautiful. The stock was polished wood. The receiver was milled from a solid block of high-grade steel. It felt solid, expensive, and invincible. It was the Cadillac of infantry weapons, a masterpiece of American craftsmanship designed to spit .45 caliber slugs at 700 rounds per minute. But out here in the Belgian snow, Cadillac wasn't a compliment. Cadillacs were great for driving on paved roads on sunny days, but you wouldn't take one mud bogging. Miller pulled the bolt back to check the action. It didn't slide. It stuck. The tight, precision-engineered metal surfaces were frozen together. The oil that was supposed to lubricate the gun had turned into a sticky paste in the sub-zero temperature. Miller had to kick the bolt handle with his boot just to force it open. He cursed. He knew that if a German patrol came through the mist right now, his beautiful, expensive, legendary gun would be nothing more than a very heavy club. The problem with the Thompson wasn't that it was a bad gun. The problem was that it was a perfect gun. It was designed in an era when labor was cheap and wars were fought by gentlemen. To build one Thompson, a machinist had to take a solid block of steel weighing more than 10 pounds and carve away everything that wasn't a gun. He had to use expensive milling machines to shave off metal, ounce by ounce, until he was left with a receiver. It took days, it generated piles of scrap metal, and it cost the government over $200 a copy. In 1942, $200 was enough to buy a used car. Because it was so expensive, the army couldn't give one to everyone. It was a status symbol. Only squad leaders and officers got them. The rest of the boys were stuck with heavy rifles. And because it was built with such tight tolerances, where the metal parts fit together with almost zero gap, it hated the real world. Dust, mud, sand, and ice were its enemies. If a grain of sand got into the slide, the gun jammed. If the temperature dropped, the gun froze. It was a prima donna. It demanded to be cleaned, oiled, and baby-talked, or it would quit on you right in the middle of a firefight. Miller looked down the line of foxholes. The mist was hanging low in the trees. The Germans were out there. They were carrying the MP-40. The soldiers called it the Schmacer. It wasn't pretty. It was made of stamped metal and plastic. It rattled, but it worked. The Germans could build 10 MP-40s for the price of one Thompson. They were flooding the battlefield with automatic firepower, while the Americans were still trying to build guns like they were Swiss watches. Back in the States, the generals had finally realized the math wasn't working. The war had exploded in scale. They didn't need thousands of guns, they needed millions, and they needed them yesterday. They looked at the British, who were fighting for their lives. The British had ditched their expensive guns and built the Sten. The Sten gun looked like a plumber had welded a pipe to a trigger. It cost about $10 to make. It was ugly as sin, but it fired bullets. The U.S. Ordnance Department decided they needed their own Sten. They needed a gun that was cheap, fast to build, and idiot-proof. They didn't go to the traditional gunsmiths at Colt or Winchester. Those guys were obsessed with wood grain and bluing. They went to the people who knew how to make cheap metal things fast. They went to the car industry. Specifically, they went to a division of General Motors called the Guide Lamp Division. These were the guys who made headlights and hubcaps. The engineers at Guide Lamp didn't know anything about gunsmithing, and that was exactly why they were perfect for the job. They looked at the Thompson and laughed. They saw wasted time and wasted money. They didn't want to use milling machines. They wanted to use stamping presses. They wanted to take sheets of steel, punch them into shapes like cookie dough, weld them together, and call it a gun. They designed a weapon that broke every rule of military tradition. It didn't have a walnut stock. It had a bent piece of heavy wire. It didn't have a finely machined charging handle. It had a hole in the bolt you stuck your finger into. It didn't have cooling fins. It didn't have a selectable fire switch. It was full auto only. It looked like a tool you would find on the floor of a garage, covered in oil and grime. In fact, it looked exactly like the pneumatic grease guns mechanics used to lubricate tank treads. When the prototypes were shown to the army brass, the reaction was horror. The generals were used to polished wood and blued steel. They looked at this gray, welded monstrosity and felt insulted. It looked cheap. It felt cheap. They worried it would demoralize the troops. How could you ask a soldier to fight for his country carrying a piece of stamped sheet metal that cost less than a good pair of boots? But the tests didn't lie. The grease gun, officially the M3, did something the Thompson couldn't. It kept working. The loose tolerances, which the gunsmiths hated, meant that there was room for dirt to move around. If mud got into the M3, the bolt just crushed it or pushed it aside. It didn't care about the cold. It didn't care about the sand. It just chugged along. Back in the Ardennes, Sergeant Miller didn't know about the politics. He only knew the rumors. The grapevine in the army is faster than the telegraph. Word had trickled down to the front lines that a new submachine gun was coming. The boys in the platoon were excited. They imagined some high-tech wonder weapon. Maybe it would have a higher rate of fire. Maybe it would be lighter. Maybe it would have a scope. Miller rubbed his gloved hands together, trying to get feeling back into his fingers. He looked at his frozen Thompson. He imagined the new gun. He pictured something sleek, something deadly. He hoped it would be here soon. The Germans were pushing hard. The Battle of the Bulge was beginning, and the American lines were thinning. They needed firepower. They needed something that could pour lead into the gray waves of German infantry attacking through the snow. The supply trucks were struggling through the drifts behind the line. They were carrying crates marked secret. Inside those crates was the answer to Miller's problem. But it wasn't the answer he was expecting. It wasn't a sleek weapon of the future. It was the ugly duckling of the arsenal of democracy. Miller heard the sound of an engine. A deuce-and-a-half truck skidded to a halt on the frozen road behind their position. "Ammo and resupply," the driver shouted, his breath steaming in the air. Miller grabbed his freezing Thompson and climbed out of the foxhole. "About time," he muttered. He walked over to the truck. The supply sergeant on the back was kicking wooden crates off the tailgate. They landed with a heavy thud in the snow. New toys for the squad leaders. The supply sergeant grinned, prying the lid off the nearest crate with a crowbar. Miller leaned in, expecting to see shiny new Thompsons, or maybe the new rising guns. He looked into the crate. He blinked. He reached in and pulled out a gray, oily metal object. It felt cold and lifeless. It had rough weld marks running down the middle. It looked like someone had welded a bicycle pump to a car muffler. "What the hell is this?" Miller asked, holding it up by the magazine well. "That," the supply sergeant laughed, "is the M3. The latest and greatest from Uncle Sam." Miller looked at the wire stock. He looked at the crude sights that were just bumps of metal welded to the top. He looked at the ejection port cover that flopped open like a trap door. He felt a knot form in his stomach. He was about to face the elite German panzer divisions, and the army had sent him a caulk gun. The soldiers from his squad gathered around. They looked at the Thompson in Miller's left hand, beautiful, frozen, useless. Then they looked at the M3 in his right hand, ugly, cheap, and unknown. "Hey, Sarge," one of the privates snickered. "Did that come with a tube of grease?" "I think my tank tracks are squeaking." The men laughed. It was a dark, nervous laugh. They poked at the new weapon. They called it the Cake Decorator. They called it the Woolworth gun. They tapped on the hollow magazine well. It rang like a tin can. Miller didn't laugh. He felt betrayed. He felt like the army was cutting corners with his life. He looked at the supply sergeant. "You expect me to kill Nazis with this? Orders are to turn in the Thompsons," the sergeant said, shrugging. "That's your new baby. Better get used to it." Miller looked at the M3 again. It was lighter than the Thompson, that was true, but it felt like a toy. He pulled the bolt back. It didn't slide on polished rails. It grinded on two steel guide rods. Clack-clunk. It sounded rough. It sounded like a garage door opening. He didn't know it yet, but that rough, clunky sound was the sound of survival. He didn't know that the garage tool in his hand was about to do things the Cadillac could never dream of. He stood there in the snow, holding the ugly piece of metal, while the sound of German artillery grew louder in the distance. The test wasn't going to be on a target range. It was going to be right here, in the mud and the blood of the Ardennes, and the grease gun was about to get its first chance to prove the mockery wrong. The first thing Sergeant Miller learned about the M3 grease gun was that loading it was a fight. The magazine held 30 rounds of heavy .45 caliber ammunition, the same fat slugs used in the Colt pistol. But getting those 30 rounds into the magazine was a test of strength that made grown men cry. The spring inside was so stiff it felt like it had been taken out of a truck suspension. You could get the first 10 rounds in with your thumb. The next 10 required you to push down with all your weight, cursing the designer's mother with every bullet. The last 10 were impossible unless you used a special loading tool. If you lost that tool in the snow, you were fighting the war with a half-loaded gun. The squad spent the night of December 18th huddling in their foxholes, wrestling with the new weapons. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. The grease in the new guns was thick and sticky, but unlike the oil in the Thompsons, it didn't seem to glue the parts together. It just made everything move in slow motion. Miller sat there, staring at the ugly gray tube in his lap. He felt naked, A soldier's confidence comes from his weapon. If you hold a rifle that feels like a precision instrument, you feel like a marksman. If you hold a welded pipe that rattles when you shake it, you feel like a victim. He looked at the stock, just a bent piece of thick wire that looked like a coat hanger. It didn't offer a comfortable cheek weld. It dug into your shoulder. It slid around on your winter coat. And then there was the cocking handle. On the Thompson, you had a solid knob on top, or on the side that you could rack back with a satisfying metallic clack. On this thing, there was a weird crank on the side that looked like the handle on a fishing reel. You had to pull it back to arm the bolt. It felt flimsy. The soldiers whispered that if you yanked it too hard, it would snap right off in your hand. "Hey, Sarge," Private Kowalski whispered from the next hole. "My safety cover is frozen." Miller crawled over. The M3 didn't have a safety switch. It had a dust cover, a flap of metal on a spring that covered the ejection port. When the flap was closed, a metal tab physically blocked the bolt from moving forward. To fire, you had to flip the flap open. It was crude. It was the kind of safety mechanism you'd find on a garden gate, not a machine gun. Kowalski's cover was caked with ice. Miller hit it with the heel of his hand. It snapped open with a hollow clunk. "It works," Miller grunted. "Just hit it harder." That seemed to be the instruction manual for the whole weapon. If it doesn't work, hit it. You couldn't hurt it. It was already ugly. The test came 3 hours later. The Germans weren't waiting for the weather to clear. They were pushing hard, probing the American lines for weak spots. They used infiltration tactics. They sent small groups of white-clad infantry crawling through the snow, moving silently between the trees, trying to get close enough to throw grenades into the foxholes before anyone saw them. Miller was half asleep when he heard the crunch of a boot on ice. It was a distinctive sound, dry and sharp, like stepping on cornflakes. He snapped awake. The mist was thick, reducing visibility to maybe 20 yards. He saw a shadow move, then another. "Contact front," Miller yelled. The tree line erupted. The Germans opened up with their MP-40s. The air filled with the angry zip-zip-zip of 9mm bullets. The American line returned fire. To Miller's left, a barman squeezed the trigger of his Browning automatic rifle. Bang, bang, click. The gun jammed. The gas regulator was clogged with frozen condensation. The soldier frantically tried to rack the slide, cursing. To his right, a soldier with a Thompson stood up to fire. He pulled the trigger. The bolt went forward sluggishly, robbed of its energy by the cold oil. It didn't have enough force to strip the round and fire it. Thunk, misfire. Miller saw a German soldier sprinting toward him, a potato masher grenade in his hand. Miller raised the grease gun. He didn't have time to aim properly. He just pointed the tube and squeezed the long, stamp metal trigger. He expected a buzz. He expected the gun to vibrate violently like the Thompson did. Instead, the gun went chug, 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 chug. It was the slowest automatic fire Miller had ever heard. The Thompson fired so fast it sounded like a tearing bedsheet. The grease gun fired so slow you could almost count the bullets leaving the barrel. Pop, 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 pop. 450 rounds per minute. It sounded like a tractor idling on a cold morning. It sounded broken. But as the heavy .45 caliber slugs left the barrel, something amazing happened. The gun didn't climb. With a Thompson, the high rate of fire made the muzzle want to drift up into the sky. You had to fight it, wrestling the barrel down to keep bullets on target. If you fired a long burst, your first shot hit the enemy, and your last shot hit the birds in the trees. The grease gun was different. Because the heavy bolt moved back and forth so slowly, the recoil was a rhythmic, rocking motion. It was a gentle push, not a violent kick. The gun stayed exactly where Miller pointed it. He held the trigger down. The line of bullets didn't spray, it walked. He watched the impacts kick up snow in a straight line, right into the chest of the running German. The heavy slugs hit with the force of a sledgehammer. The German soldier didn't just fall. He was thrown backward, the grenade flying harmlessly into the snow. Miller swung the barrel to the right. He didn't let off the trigger. The gun kept chugging, a steady, rhythmic beat of death. Chug, chug, chug. He walked the fire onto a second German, who was trying to flank Kowalski. The slow rate of fire made it feel like he was using a garden hose to water a flower bed. He could adjust his aim in the middle of the burst. He saw the bullets hitting the dirt to the left of the enemy, so he just nudged the barrel right. The next 3 rounds center punched the target. The gun didn't jam. The loose, sloppy fit of the heavy bolt meant that the ice and grit inside didn't matter. The bolt just plowed through the crud like a bulldozer. The ejection port flap was open, and giant brass casings were tumbling out into the snow, steaming in the cold air. The firefight lasted less than a minute. The German probe shattered against the wall of slow, heavy fire. The surviving attackers melted back into the mist, leaving 4 bodies in the snow. Silence returned to the foxholes, but it was a different kind of silence. The men weren't shivering in fear anymore. They were staring at their weapons. "Holy cow," Kowalski said, looking at his grease gun. "Did you see that? It didn't climb an inch." Miller looked at the smoking metal tube in his hands. The paint was bubbling on the barrel. It was ugly. It looked like a piece of plumbing that had fallen off a truck, but it had just killed 2 men at 30 yards without a single malfunction, while the expensive guns were frozen solid. "It shoots slow," Miller said, still processing the feeling. "It's like firing a pistol one shot at a time, but without stopping." The mockery began to fade. The men realized that the garage tool had a secret. The engineers at Guide Lamp hadn't made it slow because they were lazy. They made it slow because slow meant control. In the panic of a close-range ambush, you didn't need a gun that emptied its magazine in 2 seconds. You needed a gun that let you steer the bullets. Miller reloaded. He had to fight the magazine spring again, shoving the fresh rounds in with his frozen thumbs. But this time, he didn't curse the designer. He respected the machine. It was crude, but it was honest. It was a blue-collar gun for a blue-collar war. "Check your ammo," Miller ordered, his voice steady. "They were just testing us. That wasn't the main force." He was right. The probe was just the jab before the knockout punch. As the sun began to rise, struggling to pierce the gray overcast, a low rumble started deep in the forest. It wasn't the sound of boots this time. It was a mechanical growl, deep and vibrating, that shook the frozen ground. It grew louder, layering over itself until the air was filled with the sound of diesel engines and clanking steel tracks. Miller peered over the edge of his foxhole. The mist was thinning. Through the trees he saw shapes, big shapes. They were massive, blocky shadows moving with terrifying, unstoppable weight. "Tanks," someone yelled down the line. These weren't the light reconnaissance tanks. These were the monsters. Tiger IIs, King Tigers. 68 tons of armor and a long 88mm gun that could snipe a bunker from a mile away. And walking beside them were hundreds of infantrymen, the main body of the Volksgrenadier Division. Miller looked at his squad. They were gripping their grease guns, the cake decorators. They suddenly looked very small. A .45 caliber submachine gun might be great for stopping a patrol, but against a King Tiger, it was like throwing pebbles at a skyscraper. The German armor broke through the tree line 300 yards away. The lead tank traversed its turret. The massive gun barrel swung toward Miller's position. "Hold fire," Miller screamed. "Wait for the infantry. Don't shoot the tanks." The grease gun had saved them from the probe. But now, the scrap metal weapon was the only thing standing between the platoon and a massacre. The real test hadn't even started. The ugly gun had worked when it was easy. Now it had to work when it was impossible. The ground didn't just shake, it rippled. To Sergeant Frank Miller, huddled in his foxhole, it felt like the earth was turning into liquid under the weight of the steel monsters approaching his line. The King Tiger tank was the ultimate predator of the European theater. It weighed nearly 70 tons. Its front armor was 6 inches thick and sloped so sharply that American shells just bounced off it like tennis balls. And then there was the gun. The 88mm cannon stuck out of the turret like a telephone pole. It could put a high-explosive shell through a window from 2 miles away. Walking beside these steel giants were the German infantry. They looked confident, and why wouldn't they be? They were using the tanks as mobile shields. They knew the Americans were terrifyingly outgunned. They knew the Americans were armed with frozen rifles and jamming submachine guns. They expected the Americans to run. Miller watched them come through the sights of his M3. The crude, welded metal peep sight was barely more than a hole punched in a piece of steel, but it framed the gray coats of the enemy perfectly. The distance closed 300 yards, 200 yards. Miller's heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hands were steady. He wasn't gripping polished walnut anymore. He was gripping cold, stamped steel. And surprisingly, it felt good. It felt honest. He waited until he could see the steam rising from the German soldier's breath. 100 yards, 50 yards. "Now," Miller yelled. The American line erupted. But it wasn't the frantic, panic fire of inexperienced troops. It was a rhythmic, heavy pounding. Chug, 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 chug. The sound of 12 M3 grease guns opening up at once was unlike anything the Germans had ever heard. Usually an ambush meant a high-pitched buzz of rapid fire that exhausted itself in 3 seconds. This was different. This was a slow, relentless drumbeat. The heavy .45 caliber bullets flew through the air at barely 900 feet per second, slow enough that you could almost see them, but they hit with massive kinetic energy. The first rank of German infantry didn't just drop, they were hammered backward. The M3 didn't poke holes in men, it smashed them. The slow rate of fire allowed Miller and his men to adjust their aim between every single shot. They didn't spray the area, they walked the rounds into the targets. Miller held his trigger down. The gun rocked gently against his shoulder. He saw a German machine gunner setting up his MG42 behind a stump. Miller didn't panic. He simply steered the stream of heavy bullets toward the stump. 1, 2, 3 rounds. The machine gunner collapsed. The German infantry dived for cover, but the snow offered no protection against the heavy slugs. The grease guns kept chugging. The 30-round magazine seemed to last forever because the gun fired so slowly. A soldier with a Thompson would have been empty in 2 seconds. Miller was still firing 5 seconds later, suppressing an entire squad with a single magazine. But the tanks were still coming. The lead King Tiger ignored the small arms fire. The bullets pinged off its armor like hail on a tin roof. The tank commander, confident in his invincibility, popped the hatch open to get a better view. He scanned the tree line, looking for the muzzle flashes of anti-tank guns. He never saw them. Instead, he met Sergeant Miller. Miller shifted his aim. He didn't have a scope. He didn't have a precision barrel, but he had a gun that didn't jump. He put the crude iron sights on the open hatch of the tank. He fired a 3-round burst, thump, thump, thump. The slow cycle of the bolt allowed the gun to settle back on target instantly. The heavy slugs smashed into the cupola. The German commander slumped forward, then slid back inside the turret. The hatch slammed shut. "They're buttoned up," Miller screamed. "Blind them." This was the weakness of the tank. When the hatches are closed, the crew can only see through tiny glass prisms called vision blocks. If you can smash those blocks, the 70-ton monster becomes a blind, stumbling beast. The squad concentrated their fire. They weren't trying to penetrate the armor. They were scouring the surface. The heavy 45 caliber rounds shattered the glass vision ports. They sparked off the machine gun mounts. The tank drivers, suddenly blind, panicked. The lead King Tiger lurched to a stop, its tracks churning the mud. It swung its massive turret wildly, trying to find a target, firing its machine gun into the empty trees. This was the moment the scrap metal gun shone. In the chaos of the battle, mud was flying everywhere. Explosions threw dirt and slush into the foxholes. Private Kowalski, to Miller's left, took a near miss from a mortar. He was buried in a wave of wet earth. He scrambled up, shaking the mud off his helmet. His M3 was caked in filth. The ejection port was filled with brown sludge. If he had been holding a Thompson, the gun would have been a paperweight. The tight tolerances would have jammed instantly. But the M3 was a sewer pipe with a trigger. Kowalski pulled the cocking handle back. The bolt made a crunching sound as it crushed the grit against the receiver wall. He pulled the trigger. Chug, chug, chug. The gun fired. The massive bolt simply pushed the mud out of the way. The loose fit allowed the grime to float around without stopping the action. Kowalski laughed, a manic sound in the middle of hell, and swept a group of German infantry attempting to flank their position. The garbage gun was eating the mud and asking for more. With the German infantry suppressed and the tanks blinded, the dynamic of the battle flipped. The tanks were no longer hunters, they were prey. Without their infantry screen to protect them, they were vulnerable to close-range attack. "Bazooka up," Miller yelled. A 2-man bazooka team sprinted from the rear foxhole. They had to get within 50 yards to have a chance of penetrating the King Tiger's armor. Usually, this was a suicide mission. The German infantry would cut them down before they ran 10 feet, but the German infantry was pinned. Every time a German soldier tried to lift his head, a slow, heavy 45 caliber slug slammed into the wood next to him. The M3s were laying down a curtain of steel that was impenetrable. The bazooka team reached a fallen log. The loader shoved a rocket into the tube and wired it up. The gunner took aim at the rear of the lead tank where the armor was thinnest. He squeezed the trigger. Whoosh. The rocket streaked across the snow. It hit the engine deck. There was a crack followed by a dull boom. Black smoke billowed from the rear of the King Tiger. The engine sputtered and died. The monster was dead. The other tanks, seeing their leader burning and their infantry slaughtered, began to reverse. They popped smoke canisters, filling the woods with a thick gray fog, but the German infantry couldn't reverse. They were trapped in the kill zone. Desperate, a squad of Volksgrenadiers charged Miller's position. It was a last-ditch banzai run. They sprinted through the snow, screaming, bayonets fixed on their rifles. They jumped into the trench line. This was the nightmare scenario, hand-to-hand combat in a frozen ditch. A long rifle is useless here. The barrel is too long to swing. A Thompson is heavy and slow to bring to bear. Miller saw a German soldier jump into the hole next to him. The German raised his rifle to stab with the bayonet. Miller didn't have time to aim. He didn't even use the sights. He just swung the M3 like a pistol. The short, stubby barrel cleared the side of the foxhole easily. The wire stock was collapsed, making the gun barely 15 inches long. Miller pulled the trigger from the hip. The gun chugged against his side. At point-blank range, the 45 caliber bullets hit with devastating force. The German soldier was lifted off his feet and thrown back out of the foxhole. Another German appeared on the parapet. Miller swung the gun again. The low rate of fire meant he hadn't emptied his magazine in the first panic squeeze. He still had ammo. He stitched a line of fire across the German's chest. The M3 was ugly, unrefined, and cheap, but in the mud of a trench fight, it was the perfect killing tool. It was short, snag-free, and absolutely lethal. For the next 10 minutes, the battle raged at grenade range. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning diesel. The Americans used their grease guns like fire hoses, spraying down any movement. The slow fire rate allowed them to sustain the fight without reloading constantly. They were winning the battle of attrition. Then, as quickly as it had started, the shooting stopped. The Germans pulled back. The surviving tanks retreated into the mist, dragging their wounded pride with them. The infantry that couldn't run surrendered, throwing their hands up and dropping their MP40s in the snow. Miller stood up in his foxhole. His ears were ringing. His hands were numb. He looked down at the M3. The barrel was smoking hot, turning the snowflakes that landed on it into steam. The gray paint had burned off the receiver. The magazine was empty. He looked around the platoon. Men were checking themselves for wounds, lighting cigarettes with shaking hands, but every single one of them was still holding their grease gun. Not a single one had jammed. Not a single one had frozen. Private Kowalski walked over. He was covered in mud from helmet to boot. His gun looked like a lump of clay. He wiped a thumb over the ejection port, clearing a glob of sludge. "Sarge," Kowalski said, his voice raspy. "I take it back." "Take what back?" Miller asked, ejecting his empty magazine. "It ain't a cake decorator," Kowalski said, patting the ugly metal receiver. "It's a damn street sweeper." Miller nodded. He looked out at the field of snow in front of them. It was littered with the wreckage of the superior German army. The King Tiger, the pinnacle of engineering, was burning. The MP40s, the weapons of the elite stormtroopers, were lying in the dirt. And here they stood, a bunch of freezing GIs holding $20 pipes welded together by car mechanics. The weapon experts' logic said they should have lost. The math said the Thompson was better. The aesthetics said the M3 was garbage. But the mud didn't care about math, and the war didn't care about aesthetics. The only thing that mattered was that when you pulled the trigger, the gun went bang, or in this case, chug. Miller slid a fresh magazine into the gun. It was still hard to load. The catch was still gritty. The stock was still uncomfortable, but he didn't hate it anymore. He felt a strange affection for the ugly little beast. It was like a stray dog that was missing an ear and had a limp, but would tear the throat out of anyone who tried to hurt you. "Check the perimeter," Miller ordered, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Reload and clean him up. They might come back." He sat back down on his ammo crate. He rested the grease gun across his knees. He ran his hand over the rough weld seam that held the two halves of the gun together. It was the mark of hasty production, of cheap manufacturing, but right now it felt like the strongest seam in the world. The rich man's gun had stayed in the crate. The poor man's gun had held the line. The sun finally broke through the gray overcast of the Ardennes, casting long shadows over a battlefield that looked like a scrapyard. The burning hulk of the King Tiger tank sent a column of black oily smoke straight up into the freezing air. Around it, the snow was churned into a brown slurry of mud and diesel fuel. Sergeant Frank Miller sat on a crate of rations, wiping the grime off his face. He looked at the pile of captured German weapons stacked near the command post. There were MP40s, the famous Schmacers that the movies always showed as the ultimate bad guy gun. They were well made, they were cool, and they were lying in the mud, useless, because the men holding them had been cut down by a bunch of American garage tools. Miller picked up his Thompson. He had thought it out over a small fire. He worked the bolt. It slid smoothly now. The beautiful walnut stock gleamed in the sunlight. It was a work of art. It felt like history in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment, remembering the training days back in the States, feeling the pride of carrying the Cadillac. Then, without saying a word, he walked over to the supply truck. He tossed the $200 Thompson onto the bed like it was a bag of dirty laundry. He walked back to his foxhole and picked up the M3 grease gun. It was covered in soot. The gray paint was scratched. It rattled when he sat down. But he hung it around his neck and didn't look back. The romance was over. He didn't want a prom queen. He wanted a washerwoman who could win a fistfight. The vindication of the M3 wasn't just happening in Miller's foxhole. It was happening across the entire European theater. The reports started flooding back to the Ordnance Department. They all said the same thing. The troops hated the look of the gun, but they loved the way it worked. They loved that you could drop it in a swamp, pick it up, shake the water out, and empty a magazine. They loved that it was short enough to carry inside a jeep or a tank without getting snagged on every handle and lever. The piece of junk had become the insurance policy. Soldiers who had mocked it were now trading cartons of cigarettes to get their hands on one. Back in Detroit, the guide lamp division of General Motors was proving that the car industry knew more about war than the gunsmiths did. They weren't building guns one at a time, they were printing them. Giant industrial presses slammed down on sheets of steel, punching out the two halves of the gun body like cookie cutters. A team of welders zipped the halves together. A worker shoved a barrel in the front and a bolt in the back. That was it. There was no filing, no polishing, no hand-fitting. A raw recruit could assemble one in minutes. The math was staggering. A Thompson submachine gun took days of skilled labor and cost the government $225. The M3 grease gun cost $20.94. You could arm an entire squad with grease guns for the price of one Thompson. The Army realized that in a war of attrition, quantity has a quality all its own. They stopped trying to make weapons that would last for 100 years and started making weapons that would win the war right now. They even treated the M3 as disposable. Early manuals told soldiers that if the gun broke, they shouldn't try to fix it. They should just throw it in the ditch and grab a fresh one from the crate. It was the first throwaway weapon in history. The war ended in 1945. The parades marched down Broadway. The confetti fell. The soldiers came home, bringing their souvenirs with them. The Thompson went into museums. It was the icon of the victory, the symbol of American industrial might. It was the gun John Wayne carried in the movies. The Army, however, is unsentimental. They looked at the inventory. They saw the heavy, expensive Thompsons and the cheap, reliable grease guns. They made a cold calculation. The Thompson was officially retired from frontline service. The Cadillac was put out to pasture, but the grease gun stayed. It was too useful to throw away. It sat in the armories, coated in heavy cosmoline, waiting for the next time the world went crazy. It didn't have to wait long. 5 years later, the Korean War broke out. Once again, American troops found themselves fighting in freezing cold, this time on the steep hills of the Chosin Reservoir. And once again, the high-tech weapons froze shut. The M3 came out of the crates, wiped off the grease, and went back to work. It chugged through the Korean winter just like it had chugged through the Belgian winter. Then came Vietnam. The jungle was the opposite of the snow, hot, wet, and full of red clay mud that dried like concrete. The new M16 rifles, the space-age plastic guns, were jamming constantly. They needed to be cleaned 3 times a day. The special forces and the tank crews remembered the ugly old tube from the big war. They pulled the M3s out of storage. The gun looked ancient by then. It looked like a relic. But in the thick brush of the Mekong Delta, where engagements happened at 10 feet, the slow, heavy .45 caliber slug was still a man-stopper. The Navy SEALs even used a silenced version, which was so quiet the only sound you heard was the heavy bolt clacking back and forth. The grease gun simply refused to die. It became the grandfather of the arsenal. It outlived the M1 Garand. It outlived the M14. It watched the M16 go through 4 different versions. It stayed in the tanks, clipped to the inside of the hull, ignored and unloved until the moment everything else failed. The ultimate irony came in 1991, Operation Desert Storm. The American military unleashed the most advanced technology the world had ever seen. Stealth fighters, laser-guided bombs, GPS navigation, and the M1 Abrams tank. The Abrams was a spaceship on tracks, packed with computers and thermal sights. But if you looked inside the hatch of an Abrams recovery vehicle, sitting right next to the digital displays, was a stamped metal gun designed in 1942. The tankers were still carrying the M3 grease gun. Why? Because inside a tank, space is life. The modern rifles were too long. The grease gun, with its wire stock collapsed, was tiny. And more importantly, the tankers knew that if they had to bail out of their burning vehicle in the middle of the desert, they didn't want a plastic rifle that might melt or jam with sand. They wanted the sewer pipe. They wanted the gun that could be used as a hammer and would still fire. It was a collision of eras, soldiers wearing digital camouflage, holding a weapon that their grandfathers had used to kill Nazis. The M3 was finally, officially retired in the late 90s, nearly half a century after it was bolted together. It is one of the longest-serving weapons in American history. It didn't stay in service because of tradition. It stayed because it worked. It stayed because when the chips were down, when the mud was deep, and when the enemy was charging, ugly didn't matter. Today, if you walk into a military museum, the Thompson is always front and center. It's under the spotlight, polished and gleaming, looking like a hero. The crowds gather around it. They talk about the gangsters and the paratroopers. They admire the wood grain. But if you look in the corner, usually on a bottom shelf, you might see a gray, lumpy tube with a wire stock. It looks like a car part that fell off a muffler. It has scratches on the paint. The weld marks are rough. Most people walk right past it. They think it's just some obscure piece of equipment, maybe a flare gun or a tool. But you know better. You know that under that ugly gray paint is the soul of a survivor. You know that piece of scrap metal saved thousands of lives. You know that it stood in the snow of the Ardennes and broke the back of the King Tiger. Stand there for a moment. Ignore the pretty guns. Look at the grease gun. Imagine the sound, that slow, rhythmic chug-chug-chug that sounds like a heartbeat. Imagine the feeling of the heavy bolt rocking back and forth, eating the mud, ignoring the cold, refusing to quit. We rescue these stories to ensure that weapons like the M3 and the men like Sergeant Miller who trusted them don't disappear into silence. We tell them because we live in a world that is obsessed with the new, the shiny, and the expensive. We forget that sometimes the best solution isn't the one that costs the most or looks the best. Sometimes the best solution is the one that simply refuses to fail. We forget that cheap doesn't always mean bad. We forget that in the mud and the blood, nobody cares about the price tag. They care about the bang. So the next time you see a picture of a GI in World War II, look past the helmet and the uniform. Look at what's in his hands. If he's holding a beautiful wood-stocked rifle, give him a salute. But if he's holding a gray, ugly stamped metal tube that looks like a caulking gun, give him a wink. He knows the secret. He knows he's holding the ugliest, cheapest, best insurance policy the United States Army ever bought.